Good afternoon, and welcome to June's Lunch and Learn lecture. Thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting and unique presentation. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to join the stream before we go any further. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program. We're going to give our friends just a few more minutes to join the stream before we get things started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline McCauley, and I work in the Programs and Outreach Department here at Enoch Pratt Free Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn program, which Pratt hosts in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland Four Centuries Project. Before we get things started, I'd like to remind you that should you have any questions or comments for today's presenter, please enter them in the comment or chat box below the video, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our partner at the Maryland State Archives. Take it away, Owen.
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Owen Lurie, the Outreach Coordinator at the Maryland State Archives. Our presentation today comes from Dr. Eric Cheezum and is entitled "The Best Evidence Yet for an Anomalous Animal, Documenting the Cultural History of Chessie the Sea Monster," about Maryland's answer to the Loch Ness Monster. These Lunch and Learn lectures are an opportunity to hear stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source materials and the value of archives in uncovering our shared heritage. The Maryland State Archives holds records of permanent value to the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. If you're interested in exploring our records for your own research, I hope that you'll come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. I hope that you will join us next month on July 11th, when Ben Egerman will give us a presentation about the history of LGBTQ people in Maryland. You can also find a full list of programs, including videos of past presentations, on our website. And you can, of course, find many more programs from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. Now, to introduce our speaker, here is Bert Kummerow, founding director of the Maryland 4 Centuries Project.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome everyone to this month's Lunch and Learn lecture. And thanks also, as always, to our able partners, the Enoch Pratt Free Library and the Maryland State Archives. All of us are very happy to bring you the best and most interesting new research on Maryland's history. Representing the Maryland's 4 Centuries Project, I have a quick update. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the United States in 2026, we have been adopted by Maryland's 250th Commission to bring serious history to every part of the state. The Commission, with our assistance, will soon be contacting institutions and groups all over Maryland about their role in bringing first to the nation. Unique people, places, events, objects, documents, and buildings that produce a Maryland mosaic put together a profile of a small state with a very, very big history. Today's lecture features our important geography. We share one of the world's great estuaries, the Chesapeake Bay, and we share it with Virginia. It's our local highway to the rest of the planet. The loss of the Francis Scott Key Bridge reminds us how important that watery highway is to all of our lives. Most of the bay is not very deep, but it supports a rich diversity of marine life. Journalist H.L. Mencken called it the immense protein factory. And most of us these days think of it as a source of crabs and oysters, along with good recreation. The question for Dr. Eric Cheezum, today's speaker, is why also cannot the bay have its own famous but elusive creature, captured more in our collective imagination than in reality? After all, the rest of the world has many mysterious phantoms. The Loch Ness Monster and the abominable snowman, or Yeti, are world famous. The fascination is they never are proven to actually exist, but they also never seem to go away. The recent discovery in the English cliffs of the fossil of a giant and frightening carnivorous plesiosaurus gave rise to some speculation. What if the Loch Ness Monster is a modern survivor of that long-lost creature, hiding in the immense depths of a Scottish waterway? Now, fortunately, our own Chessie, sighted and maybe documented not so long ago around the bay, does not appear to be so formidable a monster. We're lucky today to have our own expert on Chessie to give us the most up-to-date information on this mystery. Dr. Cheezum is an unlikely Chessie chronicler. He's not a Bay waterman, but an Eastern Shore native with deep roots in Maryland soil. He is a professional historian with degrees from the University of South Carolina. But what I found most interesting about Dr. Cheezum is He's a full-time farmer. He works 600 acres in the Choptank River watershed, and I'm wondering how he has time to pursue these two quite different careers. Now, aware of the snallygaster, the monster of German folklore who hides in the woods of central Maryland and attacks and consumes unsuspecting human prey, I am wondering if we can find any reality to the Chessie story. The monster question is, do we really want truth when the mystery is so much fun? Please welcome Dr. Eric Cheezum and Chessie, the anomalous sea monster of lore.
Thanks, Bert. I'd like to thank everybody, Maddie, Bert, Owen, the Pratt, the archives, and everybody out there watching. When I talk about Chessie, one of the things I like to do is start with what I was asked at my dissertation defense way back 20 years ago. After you get done with the dissertation, which is what this project started as, you sort of have a battery of questions that you have to answer. And one of my examiners said, I have one question for you. Is Chessie real? And that simple question sort of spun out into a much longer and larger debate that I'm not sure is entirely answerable. Maddie, if you're there, could we go to the clip, the movie clip? Ah, there we go. All right, everybody should watch this. It's a very quick clip. I'll give you some context later. There's no sound. So what you're seeing is a video, allegedly, of Chessie the sea serpent that was taken in May of 1982, and is sort of the source of the title of this talk, The Best Evidence Yet of an Anomalous Animal. Back in 1982 and in the few years after it, that video was kind of trumpeted as the greatest evidence of not just Chessie the sea serpent, but maybe any sea serpent. And so for those of you out there watching, you might ask yourself what you saw in that video. Originally, it would have had some sound attached to it, but that has been lost at this point. And I'll come back to that when we get a little bit further in. So I want to give a sort of a potted history of Chessie and what I think Chessie means, and then we'll talk a little bit about the research that went into developing this project, which is kind of 20 years in the making. So the first sightings of Chessie the sea serpent took place, I should say, in July of 1978. And they took place not in Maryland, but more or less in Virginia. They took place in the Potomac, which is technically Maryland's river, but the sightings took place over on what is called the Northern Neck of Virginia, which is the strip of land that borders the Potomac. And if you can throw something practically across the Potomac to southern Maryland. So I have a map here that'll give you an idea of where we're talking. The man who made the first sighting was a guy named Donald Kiker. And here he is, and the sketch that he drew of what he thought he saw. And what he saw, he said, was a, quote, long, dark, gray, undulating creature with a diameter of 7 to 8 inches, and that it was the size of a telephone pole with its head raised above the water. It was smooth as a snake, but it didn't move through the water like a snake or an eel, which would have moved from side to side, but in fact that it had an up and down undulation. It moved somewhere between 7 and 9 miles per hour, and Kiker said that it produced a wake. Kiker was kind of the first person to report this object, but he was not the only one. He was joined in his observations by his immediate neighbors, Howard and Myrtle Smoot, and a whole bunch of other neighbors who were downriver as you go down towards the mouth of the Potomac. So I'll go back to this map. You can see that the Kiker sighting is outlined there at Heathsville, more or less. And he lived in a waterfront property that looked out on the Potomac. And then his neighbors, from our perspective on this map, if you go down to the right, his neighbors along that frontage saw the monster or whatever it was. Now, the news of a something in the Potomac might have kind of gotten lost in the mists of time if it weren't for the fact that in July and August of 1978, there wasn't a whole lot going on, at least locally, in the news. And so the stories of whatever it was were passed up to the Richmond newspaper, basically. And seeing its opportunity to sell lots of newspapers, the Richmond Times-Dispatch began to send these news articles out on the wire, as the expression goes. And this thing, whatever it was, really kind of hit a moment in time, the zeitgeist of the 70s, if you will, which was kind of a new age experience. In the 70s, for those of you who remember, if you lived through the 60s, you shouldn't be able to remember it, right? If you remember the 60s, you weren't there. I'm not sure what they say about the 70s, but if you were there, you were probably vaguely interested in pyramid power and the Bermuda Triangle and crystal skulls in the Andes. And if you were watching TV or going to the movies, you had almost certainly seen Jaws, which had been released in 1975, and then Piranha, which is not maybe the greatest film ever produced, but it was pretty terrifying when I was a kid. It was actually released in the summer of 1978, and it involves, the story of it is genetically engineered killer piranha from South America are released into a river and torment small town America. So you can see that there's a certain amount of cultural congruency going on there. And then if you look in the middle of that slide there at the top, In Search Of was a program that Leonard Nimoy from Star Trek hosted that it covered a lot of sort of mysterious things, unsolved mysteries. Amelia Earhart's in that picture up there on the upper right. It had the creepiest 1970s radiophonic title music. And it really kind of summed up what this latter part of the 70s were about, really. Sort of people becoming fascinated by the odd and unexplained and the mysterious. And one of the things that they really became kind of interested in, wrong way, I'm sorry. Well, I guess I lost my slide, I'm sorry, was cryptozoology. Cryptozoology is literally the study of hidden animals, cryptozoology. And the classic hidden animals, the classic cryptids, as they're called, are Bigfoot, Champ, the Loch Ness Monster. Champ is the Lake Champlain Monster. And cryptozoology was a huge outgrowth of this 1970s culture. Plus, there's other things happening in the 70s, too. People are really paranoid in the 70s. Suburbia is growing. It's growing into unusual places or places it hasn't been in previous years. You have suburban scandals like Love Canal, which merges suburban paranoia with environmental paranoia. There's a growing worry about the environment in general. So there's an awful lot of kind of low-level fear going on in America, and even in off the beaten path places like the Northern Neck. And then if you look if you pull back even at a wider angle and look at the late 60s into the 70s and early 80s, America's in a state of a certain amount of trauma. You have political assassinations, you have Watergate, you have Vietnam kind of reaching its peak and winding down. You have inflation, fuel crises. So the mid to late 70s is a kind of a scary place in general. It's no wonder that there are sea monsters appearing in kind of bucolic country rivers. So the Potomac River is kind of fertile ground for a sea serpent or a something. I'm not sure that we should call it a sea serpent. There was no history of sea serpents in Maryland or the Chesapeake or Virginia. Most 19th century newspapers around the world have, periodic sea serpent reports, but there's nothing particularly Chesapeake-y about any of those. So there really is no kind of old style history of monster sightings in the Chesapeake or its tributaries. And so Chessie is really very much a product of the kind of post-war world. It's a very industrial monster in a way, or a post-industrial monster. So there's fertile ground, or water, I guess I should say, for whatever is going to happen in the late 70s with this creature. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that once the Richmond Times-Dispatch started to send this news out from the provinces, that people started to get interested. And there are periodic sightings through the later part of 78. The trail goes dark in 1979, and then there is another explosion of sightings in 1980. And around this time, then, one of the Associated Press editors at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, whose name was Sid Corson, came up with the name Chessie and worked it into one of his articles. And of course, the derivation of Chessie is pretty easy to get. Loch Ness has Nessie, the Chesapeake Bay has Chessie. So Chessie became branded, if you want to put it in that form, and became an easily recognizable name by the end of 1980. Why, you ask, is Chessie related to Maryland? It's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that Chessie is going to go into the bay. It could have, been an entirely Potomac, Virginia phenomenon. There were certainly sightings all over the southeastern part of Virginia, and there were no sightings really before 1980 above the mouth of the Potomac River. It isn't really until September of 1980 that Chessie kind of turns the corner and goes northward to the upper part of the bay, to Kent Island. And in September of 1980, a couple named Trudy and Coleman Guthrie were out sailing in kind of near Eastern Bay, which you can see there below Kent Island. And they saw something really strange out in the water. Now, the interesting thing about Trudy Guthrie particularly was that she was the daughter of a prominent marine biologist, Reginald Truitt, who had founded the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory at Solomon's Island and was practically environmental science royalty in Maryland. And so when Trudy saw this thing, whatever it was, her word was kind of taken more seriously than even the sightings down in Virginia. And I'll tell you what she saw. Here's what she says. Quote, "At first, it looked like a human head and shoulders. Then she thought it was a skin diver in a tan wetsuit, and her husband, Coleman, thought it was a dead body. The creature continued to rise, exposing a large trunk. On its head was a round object that Trudy said could have been an eye, or a blowhole or an orifice. Its head was larger than a human's. It was jug-like, and it looked like it was covered with a stocking and face head down and horizontally. There was no nose-like object visible, and between the head and torso was a 14-inch neck appearing from the side to be about a foot in diameter." Later on, when she was interviewed about it, Trudy told the papers that whatever it was looked like a, quote, rampant Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner, of course, being the famously bald star of The King and I. I'm not entirely certain what a rampant Yul Brynner is, but I've asked Trudy to explain that in an interview, and we had a lot of fun with that. But if you know what Yul Brynner looks like, I guess that image will mean something to you. What was important, though, and I should show you. So here's some sketches that Trudy made in her sailboat's logbook. She sketched it from kind of beginning to end of what she saw. And then later on, she went back and she sketched kind of a better picture of what she thought the whole creature might have looked like. What's kind of important about the Guthrie sighting is that through it, Chessie kind of becomes a phenomenon larger than the Potomac River. And in fact, it's really the Guthrie sighting that causes Chessie to become Maryland's monster, really. After 1980, sightings really don't occur down in Virginia anymore. And there's lots of reasons for that I will touch on as we go forward here. But Trudy told me in an interview that she and her husband were heading south in their sailboat, and the course that they thought that Chessie was following was headed north. And there's something symbolic in that Chessie had sort of packed its bags and was headed out of Virginia and headed up into Maryland, which, was its proper home. Trudy was not entirely thrilled about the possibility of having seen this monster. And, maybe I should take a second and say, really, nobody knows what Chessie was then or now. There's an awful lot of theories about that. And it's not even clear that what people were seeing in the Potomac was the same thing as what Trudy saw, or what later people saw, for that matter. So what the press kind of did through the Trudy Guthrie sighting and some others that we'll touch on was to suture together a story that kind of made some sort of superficial sense to everybody and create this lore out of whole cloth. And what they created was the idea that there were some kind of sea serpents that lived in the bay and sort of traveled around the bay. If you poke too hard at that theory, it kind of falls to pieces, but it was enough for the times, which of course were kind of paranoid, and people were worried about the environment, and they were worried about strange things. And so it was enough for people to kind of go with, but I think scientifically it didn't hang together. And Trudy, who was the daughter of a scientist and a bay scientist, and who was herself scientifically trained, really didn't think that any of it hung together either, but she sort of got stuck with the reputation for midwifing this creature into Maryland. In fact, when she went and told her father about what she thought she'd seen, or what she had seen, her father told her, "Don't take this to the press. They're all going to tell you it's a sea serpent." And she sort of said, "Well, I know that, but I have to know. I have to see if anybody else saw this thing." So when she took that story to the press, of course, they went on with it and developed it in the way that the press often does. And Chessie, the kind of classic modern version of Chessie was born. And one of the things that was important also about the Guthrie sighting was that Trudy was adamant that whatever it was she did see was not dangerous. She told one newspaper, "Don't build this thing as a monster." What she thought it was some kind of unusual wildlife that had somehow strayed into the bay. She didn't really know what it was either, but she didn't think that it was a monster. And if we sort of peel back the layers of language and look at this philosophically, what is a monster anyway but something we can't identify? So Trudy sort of struggled with the fact that the press kind of instantly monsterified this thing that she saw, which she wanted people to study. She thought, well, maybe this thing regularly comes into the bay, and maybe we ought to get marine scientists out there and look at it. But at any rate, she sort of got stuck with the reputation for having brought Chessie into the mainstream of Maryland culture, and the Maryland papers really ate up the idea that she was the daughter of a marine biologist, rather than causing people to doubt that it was a monster, the fact that she had scientific credentials sort of reinforced the fact that it must be a monster. So it was kind of a bitter, not too bitter, I don't think, but I think it was not exactly what she wanted to have happen. So the question is, what did the Kikers and the Smoots and Trudy Guthrie and others actually see? And that is a discussion that takes us into all kinds of different territory, from the science of visuality to the philosophy of knowledge. I won't bore everybody with all that today, but we can at least take a couple swipes at this, and I'll tell you what I think. So the Kikers, when they went to the papers, initially thought that they had seen somebody doing a prank, that somebody was dragging something down the river. There was also the possibility that it was a porpoise or a manatee, or, given the proximity to Norfolk, that it was maybe a submarine or some other kind of watercraft. There was also the possibility, kind of jokingly floated, that it was somebody trafficking drugs down the Potomac, which is a bit dark, but I guess these things happen. Other theories were floated that it was a gigantic fish larva or a ribbon fish or some other animal that would be rare in the Chesapeake or the Mid-Atlantic, but possibly could have gotten into the bay. But the favorite theory that came out of Virginia and kind of hung over Chessie even late into its life in Maryland was something called the anaconda syndrome. The theory ran this, that over on the southern Maryland side of the Potomac, in a place called Nanjemoy Creek, that ships from South America had crashed there and been left. And that in order to control their rat populations on the ships, they had carried snakes or pythons. I don't know. Again, if you start probing at this stuff, it falls apart. But the idea was that the snakes controlled the mice and the rats on the ships so that the crew didn't have to, I guess. And when the ships were left derelict in Nanjemoy Creek, and then rotted, the snakes got off the ships and they went into the marshes and wetlands around Nanjemoy Creek, and then from there into the Potomac and presumably into the bay. This all, I think it probably sounds pretty ridiculous to us now. I mean, it doesn't hang together. To begin with, if I was going to have if I was going to try and control the rodent population on my ship, I would take cats with me, maybe, but not pythons or snakes or whatever. But again, like everything else, and maybe under the influence of the media like Jaws and Piranha and some of these other films, people bought this idea. And the idea that there was some sort of a colony of anacondas or pythons or large snakes or something living in this vicinity of the Potomac became kind of a popular idea. None of the fisheries officials really bought into any of this. At best, they thought that maybe Chessie, or this thing anyway, was some kind of large sea snake or something like that. But the public really got attached to the idea of the anaconda syndrome. Now, it's worth pointing out, because anaconda syndrome is kind of a weird way to frame that. The word syndrome in this context comes from the China syndrome, which was a kind of a theory, or I'm not sure that's the right word, but a theory that nuclear power stations might melt down, and if they did, the radioactive fallout or whatever would go to China, right? That they would melt through the earth. And if you think about one of the big environmental concerns of the 70s, the fear of nuclear power, 3 Mile Island happens around the same time as Chessie. All that's in the air. And so the idea of an anaconda syndrome kind of riffs on the China syndrome. The anaconda syndrome became a really, as I say, kind of the dominant viewpoint of where this sea serpent monster thing came from. And it gave people kind of an easy way to think about what Chessie was. It's really not based in any kind of reality. I've done pretty extensive research and have never found any references whatsoever to South American sailing ships, being abandoned on Nanjemoy Creek. So it doesn't really hold much water, but it's kind of a fun thing to think about, I guess, if you're in a horror mindset. So the question might be, if not an anaconda, what was Chessie? Well, one answer, and we will return to this, is probably a manatee. And if you look here at the Guthrie sketch, which you can see in front of you still, if you're going to look for a real life possibility, you can probably see a manatee in that. I thought I had a comparison of the two pictures. Maybe it's at a different point. I'm sorry. We'll come back to that maybe. But I don't know that Trudy Guthrie thought she'd seen a manatee. And most people at the time, when the word manatee was floated at them, they didn't believe that. Because manatees live in tropical waters or subtropical waters. They are natural inhabitants of Florida and the Caribbean and upper South America. They don't tend to go to the mid-Atlantic. So the idea that Chessie was a manatee was sort of ludicrous on the face of it. But hold that thought. The historian, me, here's what I will tell you Chessie was, or at least what I think Chessie derived from. You have an awful lot of social dynamics happening around the Chesapeake in this period. And one reason why people see Chessie is because you have people from the outside moving into rural places, urban people with different views about the environment moving into rural places where the environment is predominantly a site of work. The ring around the bay, as I like to call it, places like the Northern Neck, the bay side of the Eastern Shore, and all the way around onto the Western Shore. These areas were still rural and largely sparsely populated even into the late 70s. But they're getting populated at this point because the reach of suburbanism is now kind of, able to get out there into these places that once had been kind of isolated. In 1978, for instance, Donald Kiker told the Times-Dispatch, quote, "It's a little peculiar in the community. We're new here. We have the feeling that some of the local people don't like a story centered here that could be false." And if you look at the newspapers, you really are going to see a conflict between the natives and the non-natives. That conflict is also played out in the relationship between the people who work on the water, who tend to be natives, and the people who come to the water, who tend to be tourists or suburbanites. So one person says, for instance, "None of the watermen have ever seen it. And I certainly would think they would see it if something was out there. As many nets up and down this river, I would think that sooner or later, a monster would get hung up in something." The fisheries officials in Maryland and Virginia had pretty much the same response. Robert Norris of the Potomac River Fisheries Commission said, "I haven't seen it. None of the watermen have ever seen it, and none of the Maryland Marine Police or the Virginia Marine Patrol, who are out nearly every day, have seen it. We've just never seen it." But you couldn't really convince people who saw Chessie that Chessie was a figment of their imaginations. People like Donald Kiker believed that when they went and looked at the water, they knew water better than people who actually worked on it. Kiker himself, for instance, told the paper, quote, "I learned constantly to move my eyes and observe. How long do you spend actually looking at the river?" He was a former CIA agent or employee, so he believed that he had this special training. My favorite quote, though, from people like this is a guy who was an amateur Chessie investigator in Virginia, and he said this: "Crabbers and fishermen have not seen it because they're not sitting there scanning the river. they're looking at what they're doing. Plus, they've got their engines running. If they were to go out there and shut their engines off and look, they might see it. In other words, if you want to see Chessie, you have to stop working on the water. You have to learn to appreciate it. You have to go swim in it or ski on it or stand on the shoreline and look out. Chessie really wasn't for watermen or for people who were laborers. So there's a really strong class dimension to this that gets encoded into what Chessie is. Well, after the after the Guthrie sighting in 1980, Chessie really begins to take on a life of its own in Maryland. And the holy grail of Chessie sightings took place on Memorial Day of 1982, as I've shown you, when Bob and Karen Frew took a video of what they thought was Chessie swimming by their Love Point, Kent Island home. It's the same old story here. The Frews had lived on Kent Island for quite a while, but they had still moved there within recent memory. And their experience of the bay and the waterline was, and Kent Island for that matter, was as people who had come to this place and settled down there rather than having had deep roots in the area. So Robert and Karen Frew were having a Memorial Day party, and which happened to be Memorial Day was May 31st of 1982. And they had some of their friends over, and they're looking out of their waterfront property, and they see this thing going down the bay. Robert Frew immediately went and grabbed his camcorder, which if you read my book, you'll see a long disquisition about the cost of camcorders in 1982. But to summarize that, if you live on the Eastern Shore in 1982, most people are not going to be able to afford a camcorder. They were high dollar items. They were luxury items that really people with outsider type incomes could afford, but not people who were from the shore. Queen Anne's County had, I'd have to look at my notes. I didn't write this down offhand, but they have about a $10,000 a year income in 1982 on average. So if you're going to buy a camcorder in 1982, you're going to probably burn up, I don't know, a tenth of your yearly income just to buy a camcorder. But Bob Frew was a laser salesman, which was about as far away from what most normal people did on Kent Island as you could possibly get. So you have, again, a real strong class dimension to this that's happening. In any event, here we'll come back. Maddie, if you could go back to the video. So here's the video that Bob Frew took. Again, there was sound attached to this, but it's long gone, unfortunately. So this is the best I've ever had. That's what Bob Frew took a movie of. And off the back of that, he and his wife became instant celebrities. They were bombarded by the news and talk shows. Dan Rather called them on the phone. They were called up by the BBC. I mean, they eventually kind of wished that they'd never come forward. And really life became kind of miserable for them. I did write down my notes. I'm sorry. Let me tell you these numbers because I wildly inaccurately quoted them and I want to get them right. In 1979, the per capita income in Queen Anne's County, Maryland, which is where Kent Island is, was just shy of $25,000 per year in today's dollars. In 1980, a camcorder sold for about $2,000, which would be about $5,500 in today's money. So it's about a fifth of your yearly income if you want to have a camcorder and you're the average Queen Anne's Countyite. So merely by having a camcorder and taking a movie of Chessie, the Frews kind of demonstrate that they are non-natives. So at any rate, the Frews' experience of Chessie becomes kind of cloying, to say the least. And they never really experienced the kind of joy, I think, from celebrity that taking a movie of a sea monster should get you. Maddie, if you could go back to the PowerPoint. So in order to, they became interested in trying to have the video analyzed to see what it contained. And they reached out ultimately to a group called the Enigma Project. And that was led by this man here, Michael Frizzell, and his partner, Robert Lazara. Frizzell was the man who gave us the quote that started this talk out. The best evidence of an anonymous animal. Because that's how Frizzell regarded this video. He thought that it was just incredible evidence that something was indeed out in the Chesapeake. The Enigma Project was a Baltimore-based group of professionals and scientists who, on the side, investigated paranormal things. And they were part of a big movement that kind of rode the crest of that 1970s New Age into 1980s explosion in interest in cryptozoology. And when I say that there's an explosion of interest in cryptozoology in the 1980s, I mean it. And yeah, here we go. Here's my slide. I'm sorry. I thought it was earlier in my presentation. So cryptozoology is the study of hidden animals. And we can talk an awful lot about how sort of silly that might seem to us. A lot of these cryptids, have been debunked. I'm not sure, but I think that picture of Bigfoot in the upper left-hand corner has been debunked as a fake. Chupacabra is down there on the left. Lizard Man from South Carolina is in the middle. But on your right, you have two genuine cryptids. One is the coelacanth, which was it's called the living fossil. It was a fish that everybody thought was extinct, but was eventually found in the 30s off of Madagascar. And then you have the okapi, which is that creature below the coelacanth, which was an African zebra-like animal that was thought extinct. So cryptozoology was certainly in the air, and it seemed to be becoming more legitimate in the early 80s. In the late 70s and early 80s, there's a whole explosion of expeditions into the Loch Ness to see if they can find the Loch Ness Monster. And some of these cryptozoologists become kind of household names. And one of the really strange coincidences about the whole Chessie story is that when the Enigma Project and the Frews got hooked up together, it turns out that they already knew each other. Because at one point in the past, Bob Frew had lent the Enigma Project a laser so that they could do another study of a completely different phenomenon. So that's one of the strange connections, and I'll come back to some of those strange connections here as I get along here. At any rate, the Enigma Project went to Kent Island to explore what the tape was, and ultimately they did what a lot of media outlets did, which was to take a video of a TV that was playing the output of the original Frew video. So they filmed a film, as it were. And what you see in that video then is the result of that, in the sense that the original video seems to have been lost. I've never been able to determine what actually happened to it. And so anyone who has ever looked at that original or that Frew tape has never seen the original, or at least has never, none of the copies of it have the fidelity of the original. It's kind of hard to imagine that in the modern era because we can reproduce video so easily. But in the 1980s, the quickest way to copy a video was to point a camera at a TV that was showing the output of that video and record it again. It was pretty low tech, and of course, it made it even harder to study the thing. So the Enigma Project took this tape, and they took it to this man here, Dr. George Zug, who was the chairman of the Smithsonian's Department of Vertebrate Zoology, And with his help, they put together a panel that met in August of 1982. And to make a long story short, the panel concluded that the video might contain images of an animate object, but they really couldn't say much more about it than that. And so what had once been the best evidence of an anomalous animal sort of stopped being the best evidence of an anomalous animal. And from that point on, Chessie's star began to fall, unfortunately. There was an attempt to do image enhancement on the video. And you can see here Dr. Adam Goldfinger of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. You can see on the left there, there's a shot from the video that was enhanced. And you can sort of see, well, as you see the notes, a head and a tail. But that was all supposition, really. No one really knew what was in the video. And ultimately, the image enhancement kind of fizzled out as well and was sort of inconclusive. So Chessie's story as a cryptozoological phenomenon just sort of, I think you could say, fizzles out by the mid to late 80s. But before that happens, there is kind of a second wind around Kent Island. In 1984, there's a spate of Chessie sightings around Kent Island, to the point where the Bay Times, the paper up there, started what it called Chessie Central, which was a clearinghouse for Chessie reports. And off the back of this, here's an editorial about Chessie from the same paper. There's a huge kind of pop culture explosion around Chessie that relates to kind of Maryland identity, the connection between the story of the monster and what it represented and what it said about the Bay, and what, how people related to the Bay in the state. There's also kind of a dark side to this too, because, and I think this news article kind of points that out pretty starkly. On the bottom, we have New Chessie Central Center, and then on the top, you have an article about how people living on Kent Island can't afford to live there anymore. That natives are being gradually pushed out by newcomers. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that there is an explosion of suburbanization on Kent Island in the 80s. The rise of condominiums, all of that stuff that came out of the construction of the Bay Bridge in 1952, and then the later one in the 70s. All of that is really kind of terraforming Kent Island by the 1980s. And Chessie is kind of a cultural extension of that process. But in Maryland in general, there's a real explosion of love for Chessie. My brother wrote, I love to embarrass him with this, that he wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper about what he thought Chessie was. I torment him with this article every chance I get. He thought Chessie was a false killer whale. And honestly, people our age, my brothers and my age, we were kind of primed for sea monsters anyway in Maryland, because we grew up with this. This is truly one of the great Maryland icons. Captain Chesapeake on the left, and his faithful sea monster servant, friend, whatever, colleague, Mondy the sea monster. Captain Chesapeake and Mondy hosted cartoons in the morning and the afternoon, and they sort of signaled the beginning and the end of the kids' day in Maryland. If you're of a certain age, you can still remember what Captain Chesapeake told you at the end of every program, which was, be somebody important, be yourself. And if anybody remembers Traffic Jam Jimmy from WBFF 45, he provided the voice of Mondy. So this was the kind of world that we came up through. And the celebrity of Chessie reached a kind of fever pitch in this mid-'80s period, and led ultimately to Senator George Della of Baltimore trying to get legislation passed to protect Chessie under state law. It really didn't work out. The Senate wasn't terribly thrilled with the idea of frittering away their important time on a sea serpent. But even if they did, they were kind of worried about what the actual real world implications of that would have been. Would the sea serpent eat fish that they wanted to preserve in the bay, and those sorts of things. But the cause was kind of taken up instead by the Fish and Wildlife Service, which went on in 1986 to produce a coloring book based on Chessie that took all the imagery of the bay and the sea monster and kind of wove it all together into this, what you're looking at now. You have two sea serpents in that picture on the left, Chessie and the Bay Bridge. And then on the right, you have Chessie wrapped around Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. And to my mind, the one on the right is such an iconic image because it really does connect together the geography of Maryland and its neighbors and the bay with this creature or whatever it is, this cultural thing that has kind of gained a life of its own. Eventually, the comic book became so popular that they made a Chessie mascot uniform for it. And Chessie eventually went around the state and region presenting and being at all kinds of local festivals and those sorts of things. So if you're ever looking at, wondering how Chessie became a kind of extension of Maryland culture, well, look no further than that mascot uniform. And I talked to a couple people who wore that costume, and boy, did they say it was hot and horrible, but they all kind of had a soft spot for it nonetheless. So Chessie has gone on to kind of live in Maryland's pop culture as a result of particularly the coloring book, I think. And in the 90s, guess what? It was discovered that, in fact, a bull manatee had been swimming probably into the Chesapeake for years. And then that sort of gave an explanation for what Chessie had always been. Had Chessie always been a manatee? Who knows? We'll probably never know. But certainly the manatee seemed to put a fig leaf over whatever mystery there had been to Chessie before that. Chessie the manatee became famous in his own right. He swam up into the Chesapeake a few times in the mid-90s, and then in 1996, he swam all the way up to Rhode Island. And boy, did that terrify Fish and Wildlife officials, because they really didn't believe that a manatee could survive that long in increasingly cold waters in the fall. But Chessie has kind of gone on to live in pop culture here in the state, probably more than it has in Virginia. I don't think that Chessie has really had the grip on the Virginian imagination the way that it does here. In the late 90s, Maryland fronted an entry in the Whitbread yacht race called Chessie Racing. And you can see here a picture of Chessie Racing going underneath the Bay Bridge, two icons together. You can go up to the Inner Harbor in Baltimore and jump in a Chessie-shaped paddle boat. Other areas in Maryland have tried to copy the success of these paddle boats, which at one point, if the lines to get in the Chessie paddle boats in the Inner Harbor were so long that they had to be turned away. So that's sort of the quick story of Chessie. I don't know if I would like to talk a little bit about the research side of that. Because Chessie started as my dissertation in college, and I had a kind of a strange way of getting there, and I jumped ahead here, but I went to South Carolina to work as a Woodrow Wilson historian with my dissertation advisor there, Dr. Kendrick Clements, and together in 2003, we actually finally did I finally wrote a biography of Wilson with him. And I thought, well, gosh, where do I go from here? I was getting ready to start work on my dissertation, and I really wanted to be the next big Woodrow Wilson historian and progressive era historian. But the book kind of exhausted me on Wilson, I think. And so I while we were in the latter stages of writing that book and getting it published in 2003, I started getting interested in cultural history a little bit. I had taken a few classes in graduate school to that end, and one of them was with Paul Johnson, who wrote this really fantastic book about a daredevil in the antebellum period named Sam Patch. And Sam Patch's, what he uses Sam Patch to talk about really is the rise of widespread democracy in America. And one of the most influential things I ever saw in history was Paul Johnson's I imagine it was the last sentence of the book. I don't know if it is or not, but that Andrew Jackson's horse was named Sam Patch. So it seemed to me that, that the cultural impact of Sam Patch reached way beyond just jumping off some falls in upstate New York, which is what Sam Patch kind of made his name doing. And that really inspired me to think about what these strange little things that we don't think about much in history can represent, what they can be about. And another influence was William Elliott's Carolina Sports by Land and Water, which I read in graduate school as well. And you can see a page out of that book called, that's the beginning of a chapter called The Sea Serpent. And in that chapter, William Elliott, who was an antebellum planter in South Carolina, he writes about how sea serpents are identified only with New England because of some sightings that happened there in the early 19th century. And he says something like, they think they see the sea serpent going by Port Royal, South Carolina, and he says, well, it can't be. They're New Englanders, and they wouldn't be down here in South Carolina. And if they were, they'd be trafficking anti-slavery propaganda. And I found that to be such a fascinating thing that someone would politicize a sea serpent like that, I guess, that it really kind of shaped the way I thought. And I got thinking, Maryland has a sea monster. I grew up with that. What did it mean? And so I started putting feelers out and doing sort of side research. And while I was trying to work on a dissertation about Woodrow Wilson, and it kind of took over my life. The sea monster took over my life. And I had a lot of really bemused staffers at libraries who helped unearth increasingly strange sources. And finally, in 2004, I wrote a rather plaintive email to Dr. Clements, and I said, I think I need to do this thing on this sea serpent. I know it's crazy, but I hope you'll still be my dissertation director. And he was happy to do it because he did all kinds of 20th century stuff. But I walked away from Wilson, and I've never stopped being interested in that era. But and there are U-boats in the book for those of you who are interested in World War I history. But I sort of got snagged by the sea serpent. So the early research on this dissertation and then ultimately the book started really with getting in touch with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And there was a really nice man there named Larry Hall, who was a librarian and archivist, who sent me in the era really before online newspaper archives, he sent me this massive collection of printouts at their expense. I've never forgotten the generosity of that. I wrote to the DNR, Maryland DNR, Department of Natural Resources, to see what they had to say, and they absolutely refused to admit that Chessie existed, which is kind of interesting. The Fish and Wildlife Service was much the same. And then in 2005, I got in touch with the man on the left, Mark Madison, who was a Fish and Wildlife Service historian, who in turn put me in touch with the man on the far right, Dr. Glenn Kinzer. Glenn Kinzer is one of the nicest men that I think ever walked the earth. Sadly, he passed away in, I think, 2013. But he invited me out to Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where he lived, and opened up his massive personal archive to me. Glenn had been in the Fish and Wildlife Service for a long, long time, and he had been in the Annapolis office, and it was his idea to do the coloring book for Chessie. And over the phone before I met him, and then at his home, I did hours and hours of interviews with him, and we just talked about his life and his career and Chessie and environmental matters, and what a great, generous man he was. And in some ways, my book is a love letter to Glenn. He was great and very indulgent of a young academic, and one of those people that you never forget in your life. And here's some of the things that he let me have at it or take pictures of out of his personal archive. These are coloring books, sheets out of coloring books that the FWS staff looked at and found wanting. And you can't see especially well in these pictures, but they have handwritten comments on them about all the things that they don't like about them. And that, I mean, for a historian, those kinds of things are just incredible to have. You're not often in a position where you can see what people's kind of instant, direct thinking about things was. Here are some guidelines for the initial drafts of the Chessie coloring book. I know they don't reproduce especially well here on PowerPoint, but just incredible that this stuff survived. I mean, any other person probably would have thrown it all away, but he had kept all of this stuff and had such pride about it. I think he really felt such pride about Chessie and what they'd done with it. Here's some early sketches of Chessie that didn't make it. They did a sort of a contest to see who would get the job to draw Chessie, and these were two kind of runners up. And then here's a kind of a mock-up that was done of the coloring book with some extra comments on it. You can see some of Glenn's own comments up there at the top. Again, you can't read it very well, but anyway, it's just really great to have this stuff, and that it should have survived. It's really remarkable. I always urged Glenn that he should try and put his stuff in an archive somewhere. I don't know that ever happened, but what a man. So another aspect of the research that went into this was ultimately when they came along, online newspaper repositories. I spent hours at local libraries. The Talbot Library particularly has microfilm after microfilm of newspapers. And I have to give a shout out particularly to the Bay Times on Kent Island, who let me sit in their reading room for, many, many days, just going through all their bound volumes. That's an experience that young historians aren't going to have in the future. And I think that's a shame, because there's a real romance to sitting in the stacks or sitting in a reading room and just reading every page by page through those bound volumes. And in a general sense, too, we're losing a real resource with the gradual disappearance of print media. I fear we're entering some kind of a modern dark age because of that. And finally, probably the backbone of a lot of this book was extensive interviews that I undertook in 2005 and 2006, particularly. There were a lot of people who I interviewed that didn't make it into the book. Probably two of my favorites were Gil Crandall and Lester Trott, who were early tourism office staffers. I think Gil Crandall was the first tourism director in Maryland. It's been a while, so I don't remember, but I think he was. And I think Lester Trott was his successor. And together, they were kind of the architects of the modern tourism effort in Maryland. And Lester Trott also had his entire personal archive had been donated to the Maryland Archives. And so I believe it was in 2006, I went and spent several days in Annapolis going through that. And a shout out to the archives, who the collection had not been organized at that point. It was just in boxes, and they very generously let me do that. And someday I'm going to sit down and write an article about the earliest stages of tourism in Maryland. Another crucial contact was Mike Frizzell, who was one of the heads of the Enigma Project. Gosh, he was incredibly generous with his time and knowledge. And then childhood and local celebrities like Jimmy Urin, who was the Traffic Jam Jimmy. And I even got to talk to Marty Bass, too. Neither of them made it into the book, but they're there in spirit, and I really appreciated them. So just a couple little things to bring this to a close, because our time is short. To go back to the video for a second, the Frews are the interviewees that got away. I was never able to interview them. Of course, they've had substantial interviews done over the years anyway. Both of them have passed away now, unfortunately. But it would have been nice to have had their commentary on the movie. But alas, it was not to be. And just a couple of funny things. I mentioned that there were some weird coincidences in this story. Well, one of them is the Frew coincidence with the laser sales and all that stuff, and the fact that Frizzell and the Enigma Project knew him already. But some other strange coincidences. John Barth, who is the guy in this picture, was a Cambridge fiction writer, a pretty famous guy, and he worked at Johns Hopkins. And bizarrely, was married to the daughter of one of the ministers at my church. And I'm the church historian here, so I had this weird connection with him that enabled me to not talk to him directly, but ultimately help me with some other research. Kind of a strange connection. The other really weird connection is that one of the fisheries officials who was involved in the early sightings of Chessie in Virginia was the great-grandson of one of the men who built the town of Preston that I live in, and in fact owned the farm that I live on. His name was, the great-grandfather was James E. Douglas, and the great-grandson is also James Douglas. And I had corresponded with the younger Douglas many times to, talk to him about things, and lo and behold, it hit me one day, could it possibly be the same guy? And so I wrote to him and I said, are you the same guy? And sure enough, he was the same guy. And there's been a sort of providential dimension to my experience with Chessie over the years that I really appreciated. There was always those strange little connections that kind of tied things into a nice little bow. So it's been a fun project to work on, and everybody connected with Chessie is unbelievably nice. They're really interested in telling their stories. And so to come back to the original question, I guess, is Chessie real? I wouldn't like to say, but the experience that people had with Chessie was real. And I think that deserves being honored. We can interpret it however we want, but people really love Chessie. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. So, Maddie, that's my word on the subject. I've gone a little bit over, but I hope we have time for some.
Oh, of course. Eric, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. I particularly enjoyed your through line with your own personal narrative. I had planned on asking you about how this research began, and you already took charge with that. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to give everyone an opportunity to type in any last minute questions or comments. And while they're doing that, would you like to take this opportunity to kind of plug your book and where people might be able to get that?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm not very good at plugging my own self. The book was out May 21st through Johns Hopkins University Press. I'm really thrilled by that. I never thought in my whole life I'd ever have a book out with Johns Hopkins. What an honor. And it's available at all good booksellers, I think. In fact, I lived this strange dual life where I farm and I was getting motor oil for a tractor. I know this is very strange to the audience, and my parts specialist, she said, "Hey, I was in Salisbury at the Barnes and Noble, and they have your book." So I bought a copy, and I thought, wow, this is really strange, but delightful. So I think they're out and about, and I'm hoping that people on the way to the beach can maybe pick up a copy, and that could be their beach reading. And
yeah, that sounds like a fun way to enjoy the sand for sure. Also, we have a question that during the 70s and 80s, how clean was the bay, and how much traffic, boat traffic did that have? So like for headed up for inland ports.
I can't speak too much to the boat traffic. I think it was, pretty substantial because the bay is really it's the largest estuary in the country and one of the most trafficked. And we only need look to the Key Bridge collapsing to see just how crippling that was. But I can speak more fully to the cleanliness side of things. Until the 70s, or the late 60s, there was really not a tremendous amount of interest in the bay's health or well-being. And I think it's fair to say that it was getting slowly more filthy But in 1973, there was a big push to begin to restore the bay to former glories. And by the end of the 70s, you can see the modern environmental movement beginning to kind of explode in this area. The coloring book that was produced in 1986 was actually funded with money that came out of the big push in the early 80s to expand the cleaning up of the bay. So there was a tremendous amount of money poured into the bay cleanup movement at the end of the 70s. I'm not an environmental scientist, so I can't speak really to the environmental kind of science of that. But I think there was a general view that the bay was horrible in the early 80s. I mean, I remember that. And you have massive movement, to try and stop, just freeze things in place long enough to assess the situation. Probably the most controversial of which was the rockfish ban in January of 1985, which, as a fun connection, the ban took place the 1st of January of 1985, and Chessie went before the Senate to be protected on January 29th, I believe, of 1985. So the same month that they are putting a moratorium on rock fishing, they are taking Chessie to the State House to see if they can get it protected under state law. And the contrast between those two things is really kind of shocking if you think about it. I mean, unless you think of Chessie as an environmental icon, which people didn't necessarily do that until the coloring book came along. It really does. It's sort of a bit politically tone deaf in a way to think, well, we have this problem with the bay and the rockfish, but let's go see if we can preserve our sea monster, right? It's and I encourage you, the watchers, to take a look at the book, because there's a much more artful discussion of that, I hope. But I don't think it was a silly thing to try and preserve Chessie under state law, but it had the exact response that you would expect. But no, I mean, the bay is in rough shape going through the 70s and into the 80s, and I think if you listen to advocates today, it's still in pretty rough shape.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things you touched on was the native, non-native attitudes towards Chessie. And we had a question about whether there are similar overtones of class or native, non-native perspectives around other cryptids that you know of.
Yeah, that would require diving into the whole history of each of those different monsters. But yes, is the short answer. In most cases, you see the class thing come out through tourism. Loch Ness has just been completely colonized by tourism over the Loch Ness Monster, and they've tried to steer that to their benefit. And Lake Champlain has had a similar experience. I would say that you can see more of the suburbanization around Lake Champlain because Loch Ness, Scotland has a little bit more control over where people are developing rather than in North America, in America. I think it's fair to say that in America, I can give you a different example that isn't sea monster related. If you go to Hawaii, Hal Rothman wrote this really fantastic book about the history of tourism and what tourism does to places. And he looks at Hawaii particularly and whale watching expeditions out of Hawaii. And one of the things that he talks about extensively there is how non-natives come to Hawaii and reshape, the entire culture. And we can see that in other things like the recent fire that happened out in Hawaii. Who was most affected by those things? In a lot of ways, the sea serpent in my book is a proxy for other things. And so you use a sort of a silly subject to get at something a little bit deeper. But I would say that the Lake Champlain monster and Chessie, which traveled together in the 80s, they were very closely connected in the 80s, are cut from similar cloth socially and culturally too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's all the questions that we have for today. So thank you, Eric, again, for a really engaging and informative presentation. Thank you to our partners at the Maryland State Archives and Maryland 4 Centuries Project. And thank you to the Hearing and Speech Agency for providing accessibility for today's program. Lastly, thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon. Stay safe, take care, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.